law that every time you talk about technology, the technology you're using bites you in the ankle. So we're all here. Fantastic. Thank you very much. We have Jack Lennox from the Green Party, Jonathan Camrose, if I may call you that, and not Lord Camrose. Is that all right?
Of course, yeah.
And Tim Clement-Jones from the Lib Dems, who is going to be an enigmatic picture of a telephone, which is probably symbolic of something. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, participants, for sticking by us. I am Timandra. As I was saying earlier, I am hosting and chairing this event. I'm essentially a technology journalist and author and presenter of live events. But enough about me. I think we should get going. Perhaps I could ask the three of you to give us a very brief introduction to yourselves as individuals, like your backgrounds, but literally very brief, maybe 30 seconds or so. Shall I start with Jack to give the other two of you a minute to settle in? Jack, give us your 30 seconds introduction.
Yeah, thank you, Timandra. My name is Jack Lennox. I am the Green Party's spokesperson for culture, sport, and digital inclusion. I am also the parliamentary candidate for the Green Party in Lancaster and Wyre, way up north. And yeah, in my personal sort of background, my professional background, I've worked for many years as a software engineer in the kind of open source space and within the sort of enterprise part of that. And yeah, and that's part of my sort of digital background, and I guess what draws me to talking about topics like the one we're going to be talking about tonight.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming along. Jonathan, can I get you to do something similar? Just give us some
yes, of course. So I'm currently, at any rate, for the next 10 days or so, the Minister for Artificial Intelligence and Intellectual Property, although my portfolio as a Lords Minister covers pretty much everything that goes on in DCIT. Before that, for many years, I was a management consultant, various flavors, and I've essentially sort of lived and worked, been lucky enough to live and work all over the world as a result of that. But many thanks for having me on tonight. I'm looking forward to enjoying the webinar.
Thank you very much. And Tim, can I get you to do the same? Maybe you could also describe what you look like, since we can't see you.
He's very good looking.
No, I certainly wouldn't want to do that. That would be very dangerous. Thank you, Timandra. Tim Clement-Jones. I'm a Lib Dem peer. I'm their spokesman for DCIT. I'm kind of Jonathan's opposite number on the Lib Dem benches in the Lords. I used to be the digital spokesperson until the creation of the new department. And I think I've dealt with pretty much every digital bill that's come into the Lords in the last 10 years, including the Digital Economy Act, etc., and most recently the Digital Markets Act, the Online Safety Act, and the unlamented Data Protection Bill.
You say that, but we may come back to that later. Great, thank you very much, you three. So I'm going to start you off with what I'll do is I'll ask a question, then I will suggest the order in which you answer it. But then I will also give you a chance to respond to each other's answers. But obviously, since we're starting rather late, the more concise and punchy you can be, the better. So the first question is quite a good opening one, I think. How can governments use technology to enhance the lives of people in the UK without harming their rights to privacy, freedom of expression and equality? And in fact, could I get you to start us off with that, Jonathan? Because obviously you're actually currently in government, so perhaps
all right, look, very briefly, I'm going to go out on a limb and predict that the next Parliament is going to see some unbelievably wonderful opportunities to use tech to improve people's lives in this country and indeed elsewhere. I always think that, my personal three candidates for where it's going to do that are health, education, and geospatial. I think those are deeply encouraging areas where, provided we're able to share the data in the right way, in a safe way that does not involve it being lost to irresponsible parties, we're going to achieve really wonderful things as a country in those areas in the next Parliament. I think there's a couple of things that we have to do to make that real. And I'm going to slightly focus on the positive here. I know we'll come a lot to talk about the risks later, but focusing on the positive, I think there are two things we've got to do to make this happen. First, we've got to do everything we can to continue to encourage innovation in AI and investment in AI in this country. And second, it is going to come down to effective collaboration between the public sector and the private sector. But very crudely, we have the data, the private sector have the compute and other resources. It's going to be a collaboration that's going to make this work.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And Tim, maybe I could get you next, since again you have been involved in the thick of it. So maybe you have some concrete examples for us.
In the thick of it, that's the thing. Yes, I mean, I'm a tech optimist, and as a party, we very much support science, research, and innovation, particularly amongst small business and startups, in universities, and particularly in helping us get to net zero, medical technologies, and so on. But despite that, and despite our keenness on that agenda and an industrial policy and strategy, we must make sure that that industrial policy and strategy is ethical, and that includes AI. And we put regulation, data privacy, ethics, and digital literacy front and center of our manifesto this time around. So we want to introduce a digital bill of rights to protect everyone's rights online, including rights to privacy, free expression, and participation without being subjected to harassment and abuse. And I think actually the EU's European Declaration is not a bad model. The South Koreans have just adopted a model too. And we believe very much in empowering citizens and consumers and setting a UK-wide target for digital literacy. And we'd like to broaden this out into a wider concept of digital citizenship, which I could go on, but I just want to be relatively short. And in the age of Internet of Things, we want to make sure that there are very, very clear terms of use, so that people really know what the use of their data and their privacy issues are. And then there's a whole bunch of other things we'd like to do, but I'll probably go into that a bit later, in terms of requirements on social media companies, and also protection against things like misogyny, which we'd like to turn into a hate crime.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, Jack. So off you go. But it would be really interesting at this point to know what's kind of distinctive about the Greens' position, maybe in contrast to those two very worthy and detailed responses.
Yeah. I mean, so I think my response would incorporate some of the others anyway, so I can sort of start with the similarities and then maybe come to the alternatives. But yeah, we've also got in our manifesto a call for a digital bill of rights, and I think there's a real commitment from us to protecting people. I think there are fantastic opportunities, as we've heard, that arise from technology and from artificial intelligence and the other things we're going to discuss. But it's very important that we keep this technology human-centric. So a big part of our platform is using those precautionary principles and really sort of making sure that these things that we're adding to our lives are adding benefits, and that those benefits are outweighing the other negatives that come along with something like, like the various technologies that we've been talking about. So for us, that involves, targeted piloting and ensuring that and analyzing those pilots well, ensuring that we're not actually bringing the negatives. And certainly this for me overlaps with a premise in software engineering that, there's a habit of people to always bring in new technologies, always excited about new libraries and everything else. And we've seen the impacts of this on the websites that we use, getting slower and more, difficult to use and everything else. And it's about thinking about the negative things that something brings as well as the positives. And I think sort of at the end of that is then also thinking about workers' policies and how a digital bill of rights would overlap with workers' rights. It's not something that's explicitly mentioned in our manifesto, but it's certainly a philosophical thing I agree with. Something like the right to sort of not be contacted, which they've introduced in France, and I know there's sort of mixed results of how that's been rolled out, but I think that it's an interesting premise, because we have got this situation now where so many people feel plugged in all the time. I think it's really bad for our mental health to be able to be interrupted at any given moment by our work, by our boss. And I think I'm really trying to protect people's lives so they can lead healthy, happy lives. And I think that's really the core part of what we need to make sure technology is doing for us.
Great. And I think it's interesting you have mentioned a digital bill of rights. Is that actually in the Green Manifesto?
Yes, it is. Yeah, there's
Interesting. Okay, so both Lib Dems and Greens have a digital bill of rights. So maybe if I could just throw this back briefly to Jonathan, is there a digital bill of rights in the Conservative manifesto?
Well,
and if not, what do you see as doing a similar kind of job?
Well, I think it's the eventual collection of the three big digital set plays we've put in over the course of this Parliament, and Tim referred to it earlier. One of them was DPDI, and he was quite pleased we didn't get it in this Parliament, having run out of time.
Data protection.
This is the Data Protection Bill. One of them is the Online Safety Act, and one of them is the Digital Markets Bill. Now, those three taken together are actually quite a very substantial shift in online life. They drive, obviously, safety, they drive increased competition in digital markets, ensuring that challenger companies can indeed continue to challenge. And above all, they bring, hopefully, clarity in what can often in digital rights be an untidy and not terribly well understood situation. So I think the three of those together, and I honestly, I don't know the difference between a Bill of Rights and another kind of bill, but the three of those together, I think, make a very significant and beneficial change to everybody's experience of being online in this country.
Okay, right. Thank you. Very, very useful answer. Now, I think the three of you have raised a very broad range of issues there. So I would like, briefly to give Tim and Jack the chance to come back if there's anything you would like to return to, having heard the other answers. But and then I will move on because we've got some much more specific questions. But
yeah, I'd like to come in, Timandra.
Yes.
I mean, Jonathan and I have been sparring for the last 6 months on the data protection bill, and our view very clearly was that it was diluting of individual citizens' rights in terms of data, and that's why I was so delighted to see that it was lost in what's called a wash-up at the end of the session, because in our view, particularly in areas like Article 22, it sounds a bit technical, but it's basically to do with the rights of a subject relating to automated decision making, particularly, for instance, by government departments. We regarded that as dilutive, and we didn't want to see that go forward in the way that it did. So this new session will be a chance to rectify that in the context of AI decision making in particular. And I entirely agree with Jack about the workplace. There are a lot of workplace issues, particularly to do with the gig economy, which you'll find in our manifesto, where we think there's a great deal of change to employment rights that need to be made. But also there are a whole question of whether you should have impact assessment before you introduce AI into the workplace, for instance, for recruitment or performance management and so on. And that, in our view, would follow proper AI regulation, which we'll come on to later, I've no doubt.
Yes, we definitely will. So Jack, maybe to throw it back to you, the idea of the Digital Bill of Rights, what particularly do you think it will do that things like GDPR, possibly in a new form with the Data Protection Act or the Online Safety Act or other bills that have already been at least started, if not finished. What is it that a digital Bill of Rights will do that those won't do?
I think, in a sense, actually, the philosophical basis from our manifesto sort of speaks to this in that we want a very broad and inclusive public conversation about what this Bill of Rights should entail. And so, in a sense, I don't know what will necessarily be in it, and I think there's a beauty in that. That I think what we are missing at the moment with the bills that we're going through is that they are largely a sort of behind closed doors thing of sort of a dreaming up exercise of what things are going to be effective. And I think there is good legislation that, sadly, some of it is not. Well, we'll see what happens to it after the election. But there's also, I think, some not so good legislation in there, and I think it's a really important point for us that we involve the public and that we make this an inclusive operation, as it were. This is something that we need to do together. I'd agree. Again, I think there's quite a lot of overlap with our manifesto and the Liberal Democrats one here. We've also similarly got parts about the gig economy, and we've been talking for a long time about the sort of detrimental impact of obviously the ride-hailing apps and obviously what we're now seeing through all the food delivery apps and everything else. And there's an amazing amount of convenience there for us as users, but there's a much murkier side to that when you look at how those private companies are being regulated and the huge dominance that they can gain in terms of sort of monopoly control.
Charming though it is, I have to discourage all this agreement on the panel because we're looking for points of difference to help people make their mind up how to vote. Perhaps that's just me. Right. Okay. I'm going to move on to something much more specific here, which in fact is also a subject that I've been interested in for quite a long time. So I'm going to introduce it with a quote from the ICO, the Information Commission Office, in 2021. We should be able to take our children to a leisure complex, visit a shopping centre or tour a city to see the sights without having our biometric data collected and analysed with every step we take. So this is obviously talking about facial recognition technology. So the question is, we are seeing the expansion and rollout of intrusive live and retrospective facial recognition in public spaces, such as at concerts, protests, shops and train stations. What impact do you think this will have on our society? How would your party propose to address the harms, including discriminatory outcomes, that are associated with facial recognition technology? And perhaps to vary the order, let's start with Tim. What would the Lib Dems do to address the potential pitfalls, or if you prefer, defend the advantages, or both?
Both. That would be a stretch. At the same time, certainly not. I'm not going to defend it. In fact, I probably spent more time criticizing live facial recognition systems and the introduction, particularly in the Met, but also in schools, of live facial recognition systems. Let's not forget, it was a Lib Dem councillor, Ed Bridges in South Wales, who brought the first case. I've tabled private members' bills. I've tabled questions. I've instituted debates about the College of Policing guidance, which is wholly inadequate. About the abolition of the Biometrics and Surveillance Camera Commissioner. That's another reason why it's good that the Data Protection Bill didn't go through. And we put pressure on the Information Commissioner as a co-signatory with Big Brother Watch and others concerned about PIM-eyes and Face Watch and that use of live facial recognition in the private sector. And it's really important that we have a proper legal framework. And, there have been a number of reports on this, the Ryder report from Ada Lovelace, the Minderoo Centre, Big Brother Watch itself. And we want to introduce, and this is a manifesto commitment, to introduce a legally binding regulatory framework for all forms of biometric surveillance. I mean, at the moment, there's a real appetite. You hear Chris Philp, the policing minister, really licking his lips when he talks about the introduction of more live facial recognition into policing. And that just frankly isn't good enough. So we need to strengthen biometric surveillance oversight by the Camera Commissioner. We need to have better protection for biometric data. And in indeed, our manifesto also pledges to end the bulk collection of communications data and internet connection records. So we are very conscious that in this day and age, biometric data and other forms of bulk data collection are extremely dangerous if they're not properly controlled by legal duties.
Right. Okay. So that's a very firm regulate, limit and control. Jack, maybe I can come to you next. Where do the Greens stand on facial recognition technology and other biometric data?
Yeah, so for us, I don't want to keep agreeing with Tim, but it's yeah, we are as strong, if not possibly even stronger on it. You know, we see the sort of the use of facial recognition software certainly in policing and crime as sort of akin to stop and search, and we would want an end to stop and search. We want an end to facial recognition software. I think the problem that we lead to from the use of this kind of technology is that it reinforces the biases and historical records that are fed into it. So we often see the same prejudices coming forward through the use of artificial intelligence, i.e. through, facial recognition. And I think that's a real problem. Well, obviously it's a real problem because we're just perpetuating those same biases that we have from the historic problems of our policing system as we have it. I think a really sort of core premise of this idea, and this is in a sense, this kind of harks back to the Digital Bill of Rights, because this is the kind of thing I think we might want to talk about if we look at regulating the use of biometrics in public. We are broadly against the use of biometrics because I think that this data, it belongs to us in a sense, and something is being taken from you when this data is taken without your permission. And I suppose what's at the core of how we should be regulating this is sort of on a need-to-know basis. So it's okay for data to be used when there's a good reason for it to be used. And again, a policy should be in place to make sure it's deleted and everything else when it's no longer needed. But I think this is the real problem we end up with if we just have this very laissez-faire situation as we have at the moment. That huge amounts of data on all of us are being recorded in all different ways, and there's no real regulation to that. I mean, as someone knocking on a lot of doors right now, I'm particularly affronted by sort of the Ring doorbells and this giant like Orwellian surveillance system that Ring, which is Amazon, have now got over. They're on almost every single street in this country, and they are constantly recording. And it's quite shocking. It's quite worrying when you think about where this is heading, and the power these companies can have, and the way they can hold governments and people to ransom. Because if they've got all this data, once they're in, we've seen it with drug companies in pharmaceuticals. It becomes very easy for private companies to have a huge amount of power over us. So I think there's so many different ways in which this is problematic for us, and we really need to see, I think, a real clampdown.
Okay, well, I personally have a lot of sympathy with a lot of what you've been saying, but to give Jonathan a decent into this, I would just like to say several of my neighbours have these Ring doorbell cameras, and one of the reasons is that there is a lot of worry about crime in the area where I live, and reasonably so, because there is quite a lot of crime. So there is a kind of question, I think, thrown back here, which is, well, okay, but if not this, then are we not passing up the opportunity to use technological tools to solve a problem that is a genuine problem? So on that note, Jonathan, I don't know if you want to defend widespread use of facial recognition technology or give us an idea of how you would regulate it. Give us the Conservative take.
Let's just remind ourselves, because I must say, listening now, I thought, wait, hang on, what country are we living in? There's no regulation. It's laissez-faire. What? We are subject to GDPR currently, and will remain subject to GDPR. If you want to use biometrics in any form, or if you want to process any form of data today in this country, you need a lawful basis to do so. That in many cases is based on so-called legitimate interests. And if you say, I have a legitimate interest in processing data, for example, in providing security at a public event, or whatever, you have to do a balancing test today to make sure that the needs of the person pictured are not overly infringed on in order to meet the end that you have in mind. And that seems very clear. Now, if these things are used for profiling or other further uses beyond what they're originally claimed for, that is breaking the law. That is not a legitimate interest, and that is in violation of the law. Now, I don't know if we asked Ring or Amazon or whatever on what lawful basis they are pulling that data in, or how they or what their procedures are for deleting it. But I would say there are very clear laws today in existence about what can and can't be done with biometric data. I think they need to be clearer, and that's one of the benefits of doing DPDI, because GDPR as a set of laws is not, I'm afraid, as clearly understood as we need it to be. But to argue that it's a sort of Wild West out there at the moment, I'm afraid is not right.
But to come back specifically to facial recognition technology, when there isn't a clear regulatory framework, certainly for police use of it, is there? Which is why there has been this rather piecemeal approach to some police forces piloting it and some using it and others not using it. There is very little regulation, and there was the proposal to abolish the biometrics regulator.
Well, sorry, okay, there's two things there. First, if a police force wants or feels that there is a legitimate interest in using facial recognition, it needs to perform a balancing test, document that balancing test, and it may come to a view that it does not pass the balancing test and therefore not do it. But it's up to the specific use and the specific police force to perform that.
Jonathan, if I could just interrupt, the balancing test was what you were trying to get rid of in the data protection bill.
No, Tim, that's not right. That's not right. As you'll recall, I mean, it has been a little while, as you'll recall, there's a sub-case now of areas called recognized legitimate interests, in which the balancing test is not required, but that's a very small subset designed to improve public safety in certain high urgency areas. But for the main part,
that's what would be prayed in aid, because that's what's always prayed in aid for use of LFR in these spots. And the real reason, yes, and the real reason you need legislation is not purely the issue of the balancing test. It's about the watch list that you create and how you build that, and how you then give redress to those who are wrongly identified, etc., etc. There's no proper framework which is bespoke for live facial recognition, and that's been found, by Matthew Ryder's report, which I think is probably the best report on the subject. But it also explains why the College of Policing had to do a voluntary set of guidance, which is not adequate in itself. But it was because they recognised that there wasn't a full legislative framework for it. And by the way, what is going to have to happen as a result of the European Convention coming down the track on AI, which of course live facial recognition is a form of, is probably going to be some kind of judicial sanction on the use of live facial recognition. Otherwise, it won't conform to the new European Council of Europe Framework Convention on AI. Now, of course, I'm sure your colleagues would probably want to abolish that. But the fact is that if that comes through, then it will put greater requirements on the police, welcome requirements, in my view, to have further judicial steps before you can introduce LFR into a particular set of circumstances.
Okay, so I'm going to let Jonathan reply to that, and then I'm going to see if Jack wants to add anything, and then I'm going to move on to the next question. So, Jonathan.
Well, I mean, two things. I won't perhaps get into the nitty-gritty. Tim and I have been throwing nitty-gritty of this at each other for some time, and I'm sure we both rather do other things. But look, I would say when members of my family are going to concerts or crowded places or football matches, I'm pretty happy actually that they are protected by the safe use of facial recognition or other biometrics technology. That gives me some reassurance, and I would hate that not to be possible. The other, just very briefly to touch on this idea that the biometrics commissioner is going to sort of stop existing. Just very briefly, we had got into this slightly organically odd position of overlapping responsibilities between the biometrics commissioner and the ICO. And the idea is just simply to simplify that structure and bring it all into the ICO with only one aim in mind: simplification to improve efficiency and productivity.
Okay, thanks. Very clear answer. So Jack, would you like to chip in anything else on facial recognition before I move on to something broader?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I feel that our track record on regulating the online giants so far is poor, and I think we see when there are these interviews with Mark Zuckerberg, these select committees, and the similar things happening in the US, the lack of digital literacy among our legislators, allows them to run rings around them. I think you see them. All these things that we're not even thinking of. They're using data. The fact that the way that Facebook owns Meta owns Facebook and WhatsApp and all these different things, and you can be discussing something with a friend of yours, about a heating system or something, and then that pops up in ads somewhere else, and there's all this kind of overlapping that is really grey at the moment in terms of how that's regulated. And I think the other point, to come to what was raised about having a good reason to use this data and the right using it in the right way. Of course, what we do see is that there are these continual data breaches also going on. There are, the level of security of storage across all of these big companies is abysmal at times. And so even if something is being used in the right way, the kind of things that can end up leaking out are incredibly damaging. And this is just happening again and again. It's an almost weekly thing now. When these sort of password things started happening years ago, that was one thing. But now we're seeing our data just slathered all over the internet. And this is part of the problem, is that if we don't regulate these things properly in the first place, we can end up with, I'm sure Ring have stupendous amounts of data, and it's very, and I think as well, the customers don't necessarily realize how it's being processed. And maybe just one last thing, that you said, Timandra, is that I'm not saying you can't have a doorbell that a camera that is looking to see to look at your property and make sure that you're safe and record things that go bad. But I think it's the way that data is then processed, and the vast majority of these services involve uploading that data to their servers, processing it in some way. That where there are products out there that can allow you to control that data yourself and keep that in your house. And I think that's where we need to push things so that you are in control of the data. It's not being uploaded to Amazon servers.
Okay, good. And you have between you nicely widened out the discussion to the next question. And we got a lot of questions from members of the public in advance of this event, which is why we're not actually opening up during the event to questions from our side, because we got so many in advance. We've basically folded them into the questions I'm asking. Now, a lot of them are about AI. People are very concerned about AI. And yet, obviously, we're expecting to see the expanded use of AI in almost all fields of life, public services, especially policing and surveillance. So, and this is a question directly from a member of the public. What strategy would you implement to ensure that the development and deployment of AI technologies protect citizens' privacy, prevent algorithmic bias, and promote transparency and accountability? And I think probably it's your turn, Jack, to be put on the spot first. So let's see how the Greens would protect people's privacy and protect against bias and so on. And then I will come on to the other two for their answers.
So I guess I would begin with this one, talking again about participatory governance. I think it's about us having a say in how this is done. There are lots of concerns, and you hear them come up when you go out and you talk to people about this on the doorstep. And I think that's why also we're very keen to get this into the public debate now and have these discussions now about how we want our data to be used. I think with obviously some of the privacy legislation that we currently have, it has good parts to it that we can try to leverage. But I think it's so crucial that we have a say over our data and that we have control of it, and that fundamentally that data belongs to us.
Okay, admirably brief. Maybe Jonathan, I'd let you come.
Sure. Look, I very much take on board there are concerns people have. It's a very far-reaching technology or set of technologies, AI, and it carries with it, of course, the opportunity, as we discussed earlier, to create a great deal of prosperity. And I'm very optimistic about that. But it has to be done in a safe way. Now, a number of people put forward the argument that we can make ourselves safe from AI by simply creating some regulations and a regulator. And I'm not sure this really gets to the nub of it. I think if you are going to make AI regulation that keeps us safe from AI, you've got three basic design problems that you need to solve. The first one of those is that AI is developing at a very fast pace, much faster than anybody's ability to regulate. The second one is the scope is very broad, and very few people can master the detail of financial needs for AI versus healthcare, versus defense, versus law enforcement, versus education, and so on. It's an enormously broad thing for any one regulator to take on. And the third problem you've got to have is you've got to continue to drive innovation, because we want innovation in this country, or we want the innovation around AI to take place as far as possible in this country. So our solution to these things as is first to recognize, look, there's going to come a point where we want binding legislation, but we're not there yet. We need to have the ability to move quickly. That means identify the risks using the AI Safety Institute to maintain and monitor a really detailed risk register across and within sectors. We need to manage the scope, and that means the first and most important line of defense against AI risks is the existing regulators themselves duly upskilled with AI. And finally, we need to continue to drive innovation. We're in a very good spot here right now where almost every single AI lab that has a European headquarters, that headquarters is in the UK, because we are a great place to innovate AI, and long may that remain so. But we have to be adaptive in our approach. And I really worry that some great, big, broad, unsophisticated regulation model put in place before it is fully understood and before we really understand the direction it's going in will leave us worse off and less safe rather than what we want.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Tim, how can we have AI transforming the world in wonderful ways and yet protect people, their privacy, algorithmic bias, all that kind of thing?
Well, I sort of don't know quite whether to laugh or cry when I listen to Jonathan, because, on the one hand, he's wildly optimistic about the tech, but he's wildly pessimistic about the ability to regulate. And I don't believe that. I don't believe that regulation is the enemy of innovation. I think you have to understand what innovation is for. You don't want innovation that's going to harm humanity. You want innovation that's going to be for our benefit. And I was so frustrated by the government's approach over the last couple of years. I mean, they were getting it right slowly before, and now they've set their face pretty much against regulation. I was so frustrated by that I actually wrote a book. So I'm not going to go on about this, but the fact is we shouldn't just deal with existential risk, which is what the government has been talking about as a sort of distraction, or about AI safety, which is the reason they had the Bletchley Park Summit last year and set up the AI Safety Institute and so on. There are risks here and now of things like bias, misinformation, deep fakes, even over-reliance, which we need to tackle through forms of regulation. It doesn't have to be massively complicated. And in our manifesto, we've pledged to create what we describe as a clear, workable, and well-resourced cross-sectoral regulatory framework, for artificial intelligence that promotes innovation while creating certainty for AI users, developers, and investors. And I would say also establishes trust. It establishes transparency and accountability for AI systems in the public sector, and ensures the use of personal data and AI is unbiased, transparent, and accurate, and respects the privacy of innocent people. It's because there are major gaps in regulation and legislation that we need to tackle this. There are some areas, such as equalities law, some data protection law, where they do regulate AI, but not in the areas of things like transparency and explainability. Now, ultimately, I do believe that we should have international standards. It isn't just a question of domestic regulation. Here, we're going to be okay. What we need to do is agree with all our key partners internationally, the EU and the US in particular, about international standards. And that is beginning to happen. And that's another pledge in our manifesto, to negotiate and talk about setting standards such as risk assessment, testing, training, monitoring, audit, and so on. And if we did that, then that would mean that we would have a much greater degree of public trust, and we would have a much greater ability for our developers and adopters to be sure that what they were adopting was in line with international standards, which incorporate the ethics that we want to see. And after all, it was as far back as 2019 that we agreed the OECD set of ethics, which now are common ground between something like 46 countries.
So if I could maybe come back to Jack with something that's slightly linked to that. You seem to suggest that a very precautionary approach would be the right one, to really focus on regulating against harms in advance, if you like, of letting experimentation, risk-taking happen. Is there not a danger that if the UK is more precautionary than other countries about this, all that will happen will be that AI innovation will happen somewhere else, and that we will lose out on the potential employment and economic gains, and in fact not be able to prevent the development of AI that we might not like? Should we not be trying to grasp the potential as quickly as we can at the same time as regulating?
No, that is a good point. And we do, in our manifesto, we specifically cite the work going on in the EU at the moment. I think working with international partners is really important. But I think, coming back to what Lord Camrose said as well, I think while artificial intelligence, it is a very complex field of study, I think there are basic principles that we can apply to it. And in a sense, so calling on my open source background, looking at the open source licenses, for example, they were written a long time ago, and they set out a set of principles that can apply to extremely complex software, and those basic principles can easily run through the software that we're talking about. And so I think a key thing that I'd maybe add on to my previous answer as well, and I think Tim did hint at this, is talking about transparency and effectively where we have something a lot, the AI that we're seeing right now in terms of things like ChatGPT that I know we're going to come on to, getting it to show its workings and showing us where it's getting its data from and how it's compiling these things that it's showing us. And a lot of the time that isn't that complicated. Sometimes that can get very, very granular, but there can be a broad explanation of how it's got to a certain conclusion. Because obviously we see at the moment all sorts of errors that are made within these AI models. So I think there are these broad principles that we can work with across borders, and I think so many other countries are feeling the same way. And yes, there might end up being some Cayman Islands equivalent of the AI world where the neoliberals sort of run wild with crazy ideas and experiments. But I don't think that's a reason for us to try to not, make sure we're not harming people in this country.
Okay, good. I'm going to throw in the kind of.
There's just one more reason, for being quick off the mark on this. It's the whole question of intellectual property. You're seeing an awful lot of action happening with creatives feeling threatened by ingestion of their material into large language models and so on. We have to resolve that now. And of course, Jonathan is not only the AI minister, but he's the IP minister. So he's had the responsibility for that, of course.
Okay, I just want to throw in a specific follow-up question, again from a member of the public, which I think kind of brings out some of this tension. Which worries you more in the health sector, the dangers of adopting AI too fast, or of the UK being too slow to adopt AI? So maybe I'll start off with Jonathan with that one, and so that you can.
Sure. Yeah. I tend to want to avoid going too slow, but you have to meet certain safety limits. And I take the point of the question, of course, very, very much. And I see the tension between those goals. I think it very much comes down to the specific arguments you're going to make about specific cases. If I can just come back to a very few of those points. I think the Liberal Democrat approach to AI reads to me something like the genie of the lamp. It's, here's my wish list. I want to have innovation. I want to make it safe. I want to do that. The question is how. And I don't believe, and I've started reading Tim's very good book and recommend it to everybody, but I don't believe that, as stated, it is doable. There is
All right, Jonathan, by the time you get to the end, you'll be completely convinced.
Okay,
go on, give him a clear run, Jonathan.
I'll let you know. The international piece is crucial here. No AI that I'm aware of any size operates or is built in any one country. There are coders all over the place. There's there's hardware all over the place, and there's logic all over the place. And any regulation that seeks to define how AI is developed is going to have to be largely international in nature. Deployment of AI is going to tend to be more national, obviously, in nature. Now, that applies particularly to this area of intellectual property. The real problem with intellectual property is, we're very clear on our goals. We want to ensure that products of the mind are properly rewarded, but equally we want to ensure that innovation can continue. Now, if that's all we're worrying about, we could, I am absolutely sure, devise a good solution to that conundrum. The problem is the third part of the problem, which is the offshoring problem, which applies particularly to copyright. And any jurisdiction that goes, right, now this is our solution and we're going to put it in, everybody will offshore from the first day with great ease and simplicity. It won't even take them 5 minutes to offshore the relevant part of the operation to a different jurisdiction. I've been talking very initially to the ITU, the UN agency. I think they are a great hope for creating the standards, by the way, that are going to help us develop an opt-in approach. Sorry, an opt-out approach, I beg your pardon. But it has to be international in nature. National won't work for that.
Okay. Can I come back to you, Jack, on the specific healthcare question? Which frightens you more? AI too slow in the healthcare system or AI too quick?
Yeah, and I think this in a sense cuts across everything else we've been talking about. I think especially in the field of healthcare, one thing that we do talk about in our sort of broader policy platform is the idea of having a kind of regulatory sandbox where these technologies can be tested and developed. And so the thing for us is that we, in a sense, to sort of come to what I was saying before, which might sound like I'm just trying to completely clamp down on this, it's not that. It's that we control how we test this software, how we test the models and the software and everything else that would go along with this before rolling it out across, a much broader scale. I think one of the key things with healthcare for me, and I think probably for a lot of us, is to think about making sure this doesn't undermine public healthcare. Because if we've got private providers bringing in this very fancy devices and very fancy softwares that can do these clever things in terms of detecting tumors and everything else, we need to be careful how that's paid for, how those agreements work, and not allow those companies to then start to gouge, when they get embedded and they become a crucial part of how our healthcare systems work. And so in a sense, I guess when we talk about innovation, I would love to see public money going into an NHS department that is focusing on this sort of thing. I think if I was to say one thing to sort of sing a song about success from the Conservatives over the last 14 years, it is actually the actually, what is it called? Actually, a GDS. It was the Government Digital Services. I think we've actually seen some incredible innovation and some incredible work done with public money by the government at improving the way that we do so many digital, the digital aspects of our lives, filing tax returns, getting new driving licenses and everything else. And we've been at various points world leaders on that work. So I would love to see more public money going into public bodies that are working on, especially something like healthcare.
Okay. Now, Tim, I'm not going to give you a specific chance to respond on this, just because you've been plugging your book marvelously. I want to put in at least one more question before we run out of time. This is a slightly different question, but I think very important one that a lot of people are concerned about. How do we balance keeping children safe online with protecting everyone's rights to privacy and freedom of expression? Because I think this is a real, but I will let you have first crack at this, Tim.
Thank you. I think we need to remember that the creation of the Online Safety Act took quite some time, maybe longer than many people wanted, but it was done by consensus at the end of the day. I mean, not all of us were happy with the complete picture at the end of it. I think some of us would have wanted more about functionalities of systems as they impact on young people and so on. But broadly, we felt in the Lib Dems that the outcome was proportionate. And, I was a member of the joint committee that looked at the draft bill. Not all of our recommendations were taken on board, but many of them were. And I think what it's now about is how that act impinges in practice and how it's put into effect by Ofcom. And at the moment, there is quite a debate going on about age verification at 13. Now, I do support that because I do think there is going to be an important break, in a sense, between if you're 13 and you're not allowed to be on certain forms of social media until then, and the situation afterwards. At the moment, Ofcom is not really being very proactive in that respect. I think there was some unhappiness about the encryption provisions in the online safety bill as it was. We argued for rather more control in terms of either judicial sanction or some sort of risk assessment by the ICO of privacy issues before some of the mechanisms could be put into effect. But that was a debate at the very end of the bill. And I think that, we didn't want to spoil the act for a halfpenny worth of tar, basically. So I do think that what we now need to do is see how it operates in practice. They're still in the middle, Ofcom is still in the middle of drafting the codes which will apply. But I do think that actually we could have what could be a groundbreaking act in place, which will protect young people. There are some extra bits that we want to see in terms of misogyny as a hate crime, which I mentioned earlier. But by and large, I think we've got to a place where we know that we can put duties on the platforms, and we can see what risk assessment they put in place. And I think, therefore, that what we now need to do is see how it plays out. It may not be perfect, but we can always tweak it later down the track. Okay,
Jack, what do you think? How do we balance protecting children with protecting the privacy and freedom of expression of adults? Is the Online Safety Act enough?
Yeah, I think it's it's a good question. In a sense, it comes to something quite close to my heart, because I feel this cuts across the idea that these big social platforms should be treated more like publishers. And I do understand that they can't be treated exactly like publishers. It's a different setup. But the reason I say it's quite close to me is that I was involved in a startup over a decade ago now, a social network for creative writers. And it was going quite well. But one thing that started to happen was that it was, as these sorts of things grow, they end up getting mild forms of abuse, and people putting things on, and this realization that you need to moderate, these platforms. And it basically became the burden of that which was sort of effectively a self-imposed ethical view of like how this platform should work. And certainly when you talk about there were children using it at the time, that I think that maybe the same as now, the law was that you had to be over 13 and you were allowed to use these sorts of platforms. But obviously that's still quite young. And yeah, in the end, sort of we sort of closed the whole thing down because it was too much of a burden. And so many years later, to see, you know, someone being able to just live stream going on a shooting rampage in New Zealand or on something like Facebook, and that just being you know, and it really astonishes me the kinds of things that the online giants, as you can tell where I'm going with this, you know, Meta. There's huge amounts of money that have come out of that company, phenomenal amounts. You know, Mark Zuckerberg is one of the most wealthy people in the world, and I think it's utterly disgusting that they are not held to account to actually properly moderate their platforms and the damage that they're doing. So for me, the very core part of this is really challenging that you know, these big players, and as much as I appreciate where we're at right now, it might almost sound quite fanciful. I do believe that there is a role for the state in providing some of the basic services, you know, as we have done with telecommunication software, you know, with some of these basic elements of how we live our lives. It was something the Green Party talked about some years ago now, about a sort of nationalized Uber service or something like that when Uber was taking off. And I do think there is a role there for something that is government regulated, that allows people to communicate using these new technologies, rather than all of this being controlled and owned by these, you know, massive Silicon Valley companies with no interest in the public health of the people of the UK.
They are nationalise the internet. So, Jonathan, I'm sure that's in line with what you would propose. No, seriously, how do you think we can?
I think Jack and I may
protect the freedom of adults. Go on.
Jack and I may part company on that last proposal, but otherwise, very good. Look, overall, my sense of the Online Safety Act is it is first of all groundbreaking. In that it was really a very original attempt to solve a problem that had not been solved. Second, it is an exquisite balance between the need for freedom of expression and the need for safety, honed by many chisels. And third, which brings me to my third point, which is that I actually think, separately, it is a wonderful advertisement for Parliament overall, that it was able with, I mean, I did add up the hours that we spent in debate collectively across both houses, and it was something over 100 hours of debate. So, but I really think that we have come on to the beginning of a very, very workable approach to contain the nastiness of what is out there, by balancing the load effectively between government and the private players. Of course, it's going to have to adapt as we change, but that's why we have Ofcom there to do so, developing their guidance now. There'll be a post-implementation review at the right moment, and there may well be tweaks to the machine because it's the first machine of its kind anywhere. But I'm really proud to have been any small part of that, as should everybody who participated, you know, whether providing their input in consultation or in Parliament across all the parties. I thought it was just a brilliant thing. Okay,
we've got literally 3 minutes left, and I want to squeeze in another question which kind of bounces off that one, because you have all slightly slid past the question of age verification, which is one of those crux questions that if you want to protect children but you want to protect the privacy of adults, how do you manage that? So you have up to a minute each to answer the question: how do we ensure the UK does not introduce mandatory digital ID through a back door, through, for example, the digitisation of services, or assigning digital IDs to particular groups, or indeed age verification? So you've got like this, and this is your last word, so make it really good. How are we going to avoid digital ID through the back door? I'm going to start off with you, Jonathan.
Look, I'll keep it very short and simple. Digital ID from the government through the back door gives me an enormous level of discomfort. It really does. The idea that the government of the day is going to be following me around Amazon and whatever social media I use or whatever. I really feel high levels of discomfort about this, and hope that it never comes to pass. That said, governments, plural, of the future are going to be very, very tempted to implement something like that for various reasons. Some of them noble, some of them not so noble. And I think we have to, obviously no government of the day can bind a future government, but we have to be on our guard that we never go into anything like that.
Excellent and very good and brief. Okay, Tim, you have also 45 seconds to answer this starting now.
No pressure. Well, look, if anybody's starting on this route, it's government. They are trying to put in a new central ID system called One Login, which is the son or daughter of Verify. They're spending 300 million on it. Verify costs 200 million. So I think what I would start by doing is scrapping that. And the whole idea is to create a whole series of individual ID providers which can use an official wallet, such as a passport or whatever. That is the way forward, in my view, and that avoids having a central ID system, which I would want to avoid at all costs.
Marvellous. So got a market plurality of digital ID. There you go. 45 seconds, Jack, and you get the last word. Off you go.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I think what Tim just outlined sounds perfect. I think that, yeah, the idea of having a sort of a passport form of login that can be used and therefore prevent this from happening. I guess maybe to end on a note of unity, and with apologies to Lord Camrose, we are the three of us will probably be forming the opposition in the next Parliament, and so I would say a huge part of this is going to be scrutiny and is going to be keeping a very beady eye on what the government is doing. It's a shame we don't have a Labour Party spokesperson to talk to this today, but yes, I think it's going to be looking very closely at what the government is doing and making sure that they don't do this through the back door. It should not surprise anyone that we are not in favour of digital ID cards.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. Thank you for your brevity and conciseness and collegiality. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you all, audience, for sticking with us. And I hope you found it enlightening. And as I say, this is on YouTube, so do feel free to go and continue the discussion in the comments on YouTube. And thank you very much, everybody, for organising this. There are links in the chat to some of the organisations you may be interested in if you've enjoyed this event, which I hope you have. So thank you, Jack Lenox, Jonathan Camrose and Tim Clement-Jones. Thank you, the Open Rights Group, for organising this. I've been Timandra Harkness, and now you can go and watch the football on Catch Up.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.